amazing. And this has been a lifelong thing. For 12 years now, we've tried to work very hard to abolish the death penalty, and that's been a way that we think that other families won't have to go through this horrible system, which is, it usually comes up most often, which is all the good things that have come out of this. People can't understand why you say that to people. Really good things. My son, who we were so worried about, he was the one who discovered, he opened that apartment door when he went over and pushed those buttons. The guy across the hall answered it. He says, my sister didn't show up this morning. Nobody knows where he is. He starts shaking the guy and turning down. He says, I called the police. I did. They ran up the stairs together and they both tore down the door, the same door the police didn't do the night before. And there he sees his blood spattered, his sister's naked body on the bed. She's been dead 12 hours and he faints. Can you imagine what that can do? That was his best friend. But oh, you should see him now. Long story short. It's the light of our lives. He's got the most wonderful bride. They got married in 2006. I said, please, Shan, help him find some wonderful woman. You know, I don't ask her to help us win Notre Dame football games. I promise. Big things. So I have 2 grandchildren. And Shanna's favorite movie was The Lion King. She loved animated movies. And that one was the song of the Circle of Life. And we have that now. We have the Circle of Life. That little 3-year-old granddaughter I have is the love of my life. And her little younger brother is a year old now. And they only live a mile from us. And we have a great family and so much good. And it's just an incredible story, really, when you think about it. Because I've seen families that went totally the other way. And it could have been me. So that's why I say, for the grace of God, we got through it.
Part of the problem here is, this is a human process. And undoubtedly, we get it wrong sometimes. Did you hear about the guy down in Texas that got out just last week? He'd been on death row for years and years. He'd been in prison for 18 years. Mm-hmm. And they finally released him because they didn't have a shred of evidence to keep him in there. They finally processed the DNA in the case. They didn't have a shred. 18 years. They were, Texas is a pretty risky place to be on the death row. Yeah. But it's not exactly a high survival way of living. So first of all, the possibility that we're going to screw one of these up ought to give us pause. Now we know out in Illinois a number of years ago, when they actually started to look at the cases there, it became so outrageous to the general public and even to the governor, a conservative Republican. Now, conservative Republican who happens to be in jail and stuff right now, but he was a conservative Republican who completely did a 180-degree turn on the death penalty because it was such a rotten system. The prosecutors, the police in Shannon's case, we were standing in the vestibule of the church, right next to Shannon's coffin. The church was packed. We were about to go up the aisle, and I was approached by 2 detectives from the Philadelphia Police Department asking me where a young woman was, by name, because they wanted to talk to her. And they told me as I stood there about to go up the aisle that Shannon's assailant, Shannon's murderer, was in the church. And 3 weeks later, a week later, when we were cleaning out her apartment, the sergeant on the detail and the lead detective on Shannon's murder investigation told us that they were pretty certain who did it. They knew it in their gut. And they brought him in on Memorial Day weekend. And they gave him a lie detector test, and he failed that lie detector test, and they were certain they had their guy. Well, the problem was his DNA didn't work out. Now, if there hadn't been DNA there would have been a prosecution there. I am virtually certain. Because this was a high-profile case. They told us it was a high-profile case. They told us, they insisted that they drive us, one of their detectives, drive us over to identify her body. And this guy says, he was explaining why there was so much fury about this. He said, was she in her apartment, my God, 2 o'clock in the morning, all by herself, not doing anything. that anybody could construe was inviting this or wrong. And somebody breaks in, the public's gonna get kind of upset about this. And most of our murders here in Philadelphia are win-win situations. I said, what? And, mind you, our daughter had been murdered less than 24 hours before, and he's telling us this. He said, oh yeah, he says, usually we got some drug guy that's doing a deal with somebody else, and one of them pops the other one, and so we've gotten rid of him, and now we've got the other one that we can prosecute. Now, this is a crazy world that these folks operate in. And I am convinced that they get it wrong once in a while, and we ought to think about that, and we ought not take that risk. The very first guy that was exonerated by DNA is a resident of Maryland. And he was arrested for a crime right here in this area, and ID'd by somebody that saw somebody running away from the general area of the scene, who described the guy as a tall, skinny guy. And this guy you could characterize as a lot of things. He was an ex-Marine, but you would never characterize him as tall and skinny. And he ended up on death row. He went through 2 trials on death row, and by accident, well, he was reading in Science or Nature magazine in prison, and he read this article about this guy over in England that discovered this new stuff they call DNA, and he called up his attorney, and he says, hey, is there any chance we can use this to actually test whether or not I was involved in this case that I'm on death row for? And the attorney goes back to the court, and they want to reopen the case. They go to the police, they can't find any of the evidence. The evidence file is gone. They go back to the judge who did the second trial, and they explain and say, oh, well, he goes into his closet and he gets out a paper bag, a brown paper bag that's got all this evidence in it. They've been sitting in there for years. They dig it out, they test it, and they exonerate it. Can you imagine how serendipitous, how stupid that is, a way to possibly put somebody to death? Different people, I think, come at these things very differently. I don't think this is a liberal and conservative issue. There's a number of extremely prominent conservatives have come to the conclusion that if life is sacred, we have to be consistent about life. We can't be in favor of life when it's kind of convenient and impassive about it when it's inconvenient, or when this is something. For most of us, this issue, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody. In almost all cases, when you hear about these situations and these horrendous people, one of the worst ones that was broadcast a number of years ago was a couple of guys chained this black guy up and drug him behind a pickup down in Texas. And you think about how horrific some of these things are and what people do to each other. And there is no way from a distance you can emotively think about loving an individual who would be willing to do that.
Sure.
And in the abstract, when there's absolutely no human connection, it's pretty easy to come to the conclusion that the guy ought to be put to death. He doesn't deserve to live if he's doing this kind of thing. That may actually be true, but we don't have a right actually to judge, because something may happen to that individual 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, where he begins to understand, it's typically AD, begins to understand what it is he did, and begins to have remorse for it, and begins to do positive things to condone for it. And we ought to let that play out. Well, she was talking about his daughter died in the Oklahoma City bombing. And he fell into a bottle for a year. And he had this dream. And what did he do? He got up and he went up to upstate New York and he knocked on the door of Tim McVeigh's father. And he said, what can we do to work together to try and make sure that another person doesn't die? Well, Tim McVeigh wanted to die. And he got his, I'm not talking about him, I'm talking about the victim. Do you remember the press accounts of how the victims reacted to his execution?
Not offhand.
There were so many of them, they couldn't all get in the execution chamber. They had a separate, large room where they had closed circuit TV. And every one of them came out afterwards and they were very upset. He gets in there on the gurney and he gets up on, kind of on one arm and he looks at him and he sneers at them. And then he lays back down and they administer a sedative and then they administer the killing injection. And they came out and they were horribly disappointed. It was too easy. He didn't have to suffer the way our loved ones suffered. It didn't fulfill their desires. It didn't solve their problems. They woke up the next morning, their loved ones were still gone. It doesn't solve their problems.